Okay, at present we've written 2 lines of code. The first line prints a string of words on the screen to tell us to enter a date, and the second line gets whatever I've typed in using my keyboard. When I run the program, Python starts at the first instruction and continues in sequence until the end, and that's all it does. Let's go further and write more code so that we can enter all of the survey information for one day. If you recall, we decided that the data we needed was the date and the count for each type of duck. We have the daily total as well, but I want my program to calculate that. Before we do this, let's make some notes actually in our code to remind us what we're doing. When we make codes in code, we do so using our own natural language rather than Python's language. Now, notes in code are called comments, so let's add some. Press return at the top of our file and type in the following comments. Enter the survey information for one day, and press return, and then the information is a date and a count for each type of duck. You'll see that PyCharm is telling me that I've now got 27 errors. If I click to open the problems window, the first error is unresolved references, enter. And there are other unresolved references as well. You can think of PyCharm as our personal helper here, checking things as we code. Now, if I run my program, then I get a syntax error along with the line number and the item that's causing a problem. When I run the code, it's Python rather than PyCharm telling me about problems. Now, the reason for this is quite simple. Python doesn't understand what the words enter, the, survey, and so on mean. They're not words in its language. Of course, I've done this deliberately. If I want to use comments in Python, I have to tell it that the words are comments, and the way we do this is by adding a hash sign at the start of the line like this. Now the errors disappear and both PyCharm and Python are happy once more. Okay, back to the survey information for a day. Let's follow the same steps to get the duck count information as we've used for the date. The steps are to print a prompt to the screen and get the value from what's typed at the keyboard. So the next prompt is to ask for the count for the following ducks. Type out the print statements like this, and then another print statement, and then follow that with an input statement. Let's do the remaining duck count prompts. I'll speed up the video here, but you should continue to type in each one. Don't be tempted to cut and paste, as it's important to actually type code when you're just starting out. Finally, print a nice message to say we're done. After entering a lot of code, we should just check that we've done it correctly. PyCharm isn't showing any errors or warnings, so that's good. It does think that I've misspelled goosander, but that's because the word isn't in its English dictionary, so we'll ignore this for the moment. Okay, now let's run our code and see what happens. Click on the run icon to run our code. In the run window, enter some values when prompted. You can use the same as me if you wish. Press return after each one. We've entered everything and the program ends. So everything seems okay. Remember though that we're still not doing anything with the information we've entered, and indeed Python just discards it after it's been entered, but that will change now. If we want to use the data that we've entered or created in our program, then we have to be able to refer to it somehow. In program, just as in maths, we do this using something called a variable. A variable is a name that refers to a value. Here we have a variable called survey date, which is referring to a value of the 3rd of January 2023. We create a new variable when we assign, using the equals sign, a value to it. Now before adding variables to our code, let's try some out using Python running in interactive mode. Interactive mode is when we are having sort of a conversation with Python rather than it running our program. Go to the Python console in PyCharm, and here PyCharm starts Python in interactive mode. You can tell this by the 3 arrow symbols, which is Python's prompt for us to do something. Now at the prompt, type hello and press return. You get an error because Python doesn't understand what we want, as hello isn't in its language. Now type print hello and press return. This time Python understands we want to print the word hello to the screen, and that's what it does. Now let's create a variable named Explorer and assign a value Arthur to it and press return. Make sure that you have the apostrophes before and after Arthur. Now nothing happens, or so it seems. In reality though, Python has created a variable called Explorer and given it a value of Arthur. We can ask Python for this just by typing Explorer at the prompt as so. Let's do another one. Let's have a variable called total and assign it the value of 0. This time the value is a number. Check the total is 0. Now let's change the total by adding two numbers, 18 plus 24, and assigning it. You can see that the total now is 42. The Python console is very handy for trying things out before adding code to our program. Now let's go back to our code and put in some variables. The first variable we have is the date of the duck survey. I'm going to call it survey date and assign it whatever is returned from the input statement. It's important to name variables that are meaningful, which in turn makes our code more readable. Note that in Python it's considered good practice to use only lowercase letters for variable names and to separate words out with the underscore character. We also need variables for each of the duck counts, so let's add those. I'll speed up the video a bit. Let's just check to make sure that we've not mistyped anything and then run the program. Nothing seems to have changed from the outside, but as we've now got some variables, we can use them. If you recall, we wanted to calculate the total of the ducks counted on that day, so let's do that. We've already seen in the Python console that we can add numbers, but let's see if we can add variables as well. Go back into the console where our interactive Python is still running. Type number 1 equals 3 and number 2 equals 10. Now type total equals number 1 plus number 2, and then ask Python what the variable total is now. It's 13. What we've asked Python to do is to assign the value of 3 to the variable number 1 and the value of 10 to the variable number 2. We then asked it to add the value of number 1 to the value of number 2 and then assign the value of that calculation to the variable called total. That's 13, of course. In computer jargon, the addition is called an operator, as are subtraction, multiplication, division and exponent signs. And when we combine variables and values with operators, we say we have an expression. What would you expect Python to do if I type total multiplied by 10? Well, it prints the value 130, and if I just type total, it prints 13. That's because I've not changed the value of total, as I've not assigned anything to it again. But if I type total equals total multiplied by 10, and then type total, it prints 130, as I have assigned the result of the calculation back to total. Now let's take this idea and write some code to calculate the total duck count for the day. We'll call the variable total duck count, and it's simply all of the individual counts added together like so. Notice how PyCharm is helping me by suggesting the variable I need once I've typed a few letters. Pressing return saves us from typing and from making mistakes. We should check that we've got 10 variables in our calculation, which we have. Now this line of code looks quite long, and as you can see there's a warning showing up about it. Now Python allows you to split an expression across lines by pressing return in a sensible place, like before plus sign. The line split or continuation is shown as a backslash character, and the warning's now gone once I've done this. The final thing is to change the last lines to print our total. Change the text to total ducks for the day and add a new print total duck count. The print statement in Python can print the value of variables as well as strings. Now let's run our program and enter some numbers for the duck counts. To test our program, let's use the numbers 0 to 9, as I know that these add up to 45. Right, something's definitely wrong here. We've got a bug in our code. In later videos we'll look at more detail at how to debug code, but for the moment let's try and work this out by thinking about what's happened. Now clearly what's happened is that each of the numbers I've typed in have been joined together rather than being added together as numbers. And that's the problem. Python is treating each of my numbers not as a number but as a character and just joining the characters together. In fact, in Python, the plus sign means something completely different when used with strings of characters. It doesn't perform addition on the characters, rather it joins them together into a bigger string. We can try this out in the console. Create a new variable string count and assign it to the value of the 1 character, note the apostrophes. Now ask Python what the value is and you see 1. Now print the value and you see 1. It's still a character, just shown on the screen differently. Now let's set string count to 1 plus 3 and get its value. It's 1, 3. But back to the start of our code. The mistake we've made is to assume that Python knows that our duck counts should be treated as numbers, but it has no way of knowing this, as we haven't told it so. Instead, it rightly assumes that id count, for example, should be a variable that is treated as a string because that's exactly what we've assigned to it. And we've done this because the input statement in fact returns what I've typed at the keyboard as a string. PyCharm helps us here. If you hover over the mouse over the input statement, PyCharm displays the documentation for that statement if it can. This will be gobbledygook to your present, but notice that it says reads a string. So we need to change the string that we've typed into a number. Now thankfully Python provides a way of doing this using the int function. This converts a number written as a string into an integer number that we can use for a calculation. So in the console type int3, Python tells me that it's 3. Now type int3. Python doesn't understand the word 3 and so gives an error. Now type string count equals 3 and then int string count. As you can see, the int function can use a string variable and convert it correctly. Let's use this in our code to convert the string I type in at the keyboard into a proper number. I'm going to use a string variable which I'll call string count to get whatever I've inputted and then convert it using the int function. So for example, it's string count equals input, followed by id count equals int string count. I repeat this pattern for each of the duck counts, and to save time I'm going to copy and paste the input statement. We've made quite a few changes to our code, so let's take a few seconds just to check that everything looks okay. Notice that I'm only using a single variable to get whatever I input and reassigning its value each time. I could have used 10 variables named something like id count as string, but since I'm only temporarily using the input string, it's better to use a single variable instead. Now let's run our code once more to see if it works, and as before, enter 0 to 9 for the counts. This time the total comes out at 45, which is correct. Well, that's it for the moment. We've learned a bit more about the Python language, and we've used comments and variables, and have used the built-in int function to convert strings to numbers. We've seen how we can have a live conversation with the Python interpreter, and how PyCharm, our IDE, helps us code by giving information about functions and listing out variables as we type. In the next video we'll change our code to make it less repetitive and introduce more programming features along the way.